How are we doing today, guys? Today we are going to be talking about the jerk, specifically around the push, squat, and split jerk. How the video is going to go is we'll talk around through the setup, the movement itself, then we'll go through an actual jerk demonstration, talking about the push, the squat, and the split, and the differences between them. And then we'll go into a couple of accessory drills at the end. Now, obviously, there are different ways to set up a jerk in terms of foot positions and things like that. These are the base ideas that we work with as a starting point, and then we'll obviously vary and modify from there dependent on the person. So this isn't saying that everyone should jerk this way. It is saying that these are a good starting point, and you can move from there, particularly with your coach, and build from that point then. So, to start, we're talking about setup. Now, hand width in terms of where you actually want to set your hands on the bar. Generally, obviously, a jerk is done after a clean. So generally, thinking about your clean grip is where you want to be. So as we spoke about with the clean, typically you want to be talking about a contact point. Again, it's dependent on limb length, torso length, etc. Just quickly go over that. A clean contact point is typically going to be somewhere on the thigh, up high on the hip. Guys obviously have to navigate around the nether regions. So for myself, I have to go wider so that I miss my nether regions, whereas a lot of people will contact a lot lower on the thigh and it will have a narrower grip. Now, having said that, there is a benefit to having a wider grip in the jerk, assuming you've got the mobility to be able to hit that position. So, if I'm talking about just doing a jerk specifically, I'm going to be deliberately hitting, I'm trying to get as much weight as possible from my shoulders to over the head, assuming you don't have to clean. Now, to do that, reducing a range of motion compared to here, where I've got quite a long travel path, compared to wider, where I lock out significantly quicker. So, going wider with your front rack is beneficial for getting weight over the head in the jerk. However, you need to have the mobility in the front rack to be able to hit that shape, and you also need to be able to feel strong through that position and create press. You don't have a weaker press in that shape. So people who have a strong press, who over push their jerks, will typically go narrower. People who don't will typically prefer that wider shape. But ideally, we want most of the work coming from the legs anyway. So ideally, you'll be going wider, particularly if you're talking about a power jerk or push jerk. Anyway, so hand width. Generally, start off with wherever your clean grip is, which will be around your contact point or on your hip or on your thigh, based off where the clean is. And again, based off nether regions and limb length. Again, talk to your coach if you need specific help around that. In terms of your front rack height, so this is where we're talking about rack height specifically. We don't want to be too low with the elbows, because if you're too low with the elbows, the bar's going to start sliding down the front of the torso. But by the same token, you don't need to be in full front rack either, because if the elbows are all the way up, you're actually in a weaker press position. However, you will lose height if you come down lower. So typically the best position is actually slightly below full front rack, because again, we don't need to be in a full front rack to be able to squat, etc. All we need to be able to do is create that dip, which is quite a shallow movement. So typically slightly below full front rack is the ideal place, with the bar sitting high up on the shoulder, which is typically about rib cage expansion. So this is where creating a little dip and getting the bar off your shoulders to allow you to expand upwards before you catching it, before doing your jerk. If you're going from just the rack, like I will be later, setting yourself up high out of the rack means it's going to create a significant advantage for simply being able to drive vertically, because it's also going to sit closer to the center of my rib cage. After that, we need to be thinking about stacking. So when you're setting your jerk, the biggest priority is literally get yourself stacked early. Quite often people will catch their clean and they're sitting in the front of their toes, and they go to dip and then they fall forwards because of that, because the rib cage is driving them forwards, because the weight is obviously pulling them forwards, particularly once it's above body weight. All those things are going to drag you forwards. So you want to get yourself stacked. You drive that elbow high. From that point, you want to be thinking about where that bar is sitting, where the weight is sitting on top of my hand. From that point, I'm going to be looking to create that vertical dip. So I'm going to be locking the hips, the knees, and the ankle and the rib cage underneath that bar. So I'm going to be creating flexion through the thoracic in terms of setting my rib cage back, and then from there creating a slight extension through the torso so that the rib cage itself is sitting middle of the bar, is sitting directly above center of rib cage. From that point there, I'm going to make sure that I'm centered over my foot, find that midpoint. From there, I'm going to dip down over that point, and then from there, create my drive. So we'll talk about the dip and drive, obviously, as we go into the actual movement, but stacking underneath is quite crucial. Now, we're going to be talking about the catch position as well. So I obviously mentioned 3 different variations there. I mentioned the push or power jerk, the squat jerk, and the split jerk. The push or power just means that after you have gone through your dip and drive, that you are catching in basically a power position or above parallel, comparative to the squat jerk position, which is all the way down while maintaining that overhead position. Now, that's obviously going to be talking about getting into squat shapes with the squat jerk. We won't talk about specifics around the squat jerk shape or squatting shape, because most people won't be going there. But also, if you want specifics about the squat, go watch our squat video and we'll talk about the overhead squat and shapes there, which is also very relevant for the squat jerk. We won't talk about those specifically here. The power jerk, typically a wider foot position is where you want to be, and typically a wider hand position just allows you to reduce the range of motion to actually catch into that shape. Now, when I say wider, I don't necessarily mean toes splayed out. The disadvantage with toes being splayed out is that you have no control over your forwards-backwards movements through the calves. So ideally, you do want the heels to move wider as you catch. That way, you can create control forwards and backwards pressures as you go into that jerk shape and catching that bar. Now, with the split jerk, footwork is essential in the split jerk. If you don't get the footwork right early, you're going to really struggle with catching the split. Where most people go wrong is that they tend to put all their weight through their front leg, have a straight back leg, and basically everything's forward. So at this point, it's very hard to stack that bar over my ribs, over my hips, and then over my center of mass, because typically the hips will sit backwards. You'll typically get an extension through the lumbar spine, and then you'll have generally almost an S-curve where the shoulder's sitting down and they haven't actually locked their shoulder out. So you want to be trying to create lockouts and stacking, exactly what we said earlier. This is why stacking early on, before you actually jerk the bar, makes it significantly easier to catch in a stack regardless of where your catch position is. So finding a good split jerk position, really simple way. Start with your toes on a line. From there, I'm going to relax the ankles, and then I'm going to dip down into my knees and roll forwards. Now this line here, if I was to draw a line at this point where my knees are touching the ground, would be where I'd start the center of my foot. From there, whichever jerk leg is your split jerk leg. If you don't know, split jerk both ways, see which one feels comfortable. There is no right or a wrong way. It's typically whichever one feels most comfortable to you or most stable to you. There's not a right or wrong answer. From there, I'm going to step forwards. I'm going to deliberately place my ankle directly underneath my knee on that front leg, and while keeping that toe pulled up on the back leg. From there, that's my catch point. Bear in mind the stability. So if I do that again, from there, that's my catch point. Now you can see my knee is behind the heel on the front leg. My knee on the back leg is directly underneath the hips. That's directly underneath the ribs, which is directly underneath the bar, which if I stood into that position would be where I'd start from. So the idea is that you'd catch here and you'd dip and drive and then catch into that position exactly where I was earlier. If you look at where my foot is, pretty much front foot's on that line, back foot's on that line, my knee's directly above my starting point, and then how you would return, front foot first to that center point. If I go again, I hit that same shape again. Now, footwork is super crucial with the split jerk. Quite often people go wrong because they can't hit the same shape over and over again. So really drill that footwork because it's quite crucial. So again, cues that you're thinking about. Shin sits vertical or slightly back, so ankle is in front of knee. From there, everything sinks down. Back knee sits underneath the back hip. From there, knee is bent, ankle is relaxed, not pushed forwards. And from there, ribcage stacked, hollowed, depressed, overhead. Now, we're going to quickly talk about the catch position with the arms. You're going to be catching with slight elevation, internal rotation, particularly if you're talking about squat jerk, as that's going to allow the shoulder to sit in the middle of the rib cage, the same way that we talk about with our overhead squats and our snatches. You do not want to be thinking about external rotation, retraction, or pulling the shoulders down. Because when that's going to happen, as the shoulder is now sitting at the back of the rib cage, it's going to force the rib cage into expansion, particularly on the heavy loads, which is going to result in not locking the shoulder joint itself, but also dumping the bar forwards and dumping the body forwards. So create that little bit of elevation. Bear in mind, I'm saying here, I'm not talking about your shoulder trying to touch your ear or anything like that. I'm literally saying a little bit of elevation to create a little bit of forward shoulder movement to stack the shoulder over the top of the ribs. And that's regardless of which variation you're using. Cool, so those are your setups and your catch positions. From there, we want to be talking about the movement itself. So, foot width when you start. For most people, it's going to be underneath the hips or slightly wider. A push jerk, power jerk is typically going to be, or squat jerk is typically going to be slightly wider. That way you don't have to move your feet very far as you go into that. Split jerks are typically going to be slightly narrower, just because we want to create a slight outwards pressure or diagonal movement with the feet as you go into the split itself. Having said that, some people will still feel comfortable when they go wider, so personal preference. Again, some people will go rotated, however I find that reduces stability forwards. From there, we're talking about creating a vertical dip. So the idea here is that you're going to be setting yourself into that position where you're going to be creating that front rack. Your, again, bar should be stacked on top of the ribs. From there, you should be stacking on top of the hip, the knee, and the center of the foot. From there, I'm going to dip vertically so that I travel vertically downwards. Notice how the hip stays in line with that stick, so the rib cage stays in line with that stick, and the bar would be in line with that stick. How deep you go is not as deep as you think. Typically, it's the end range of your ankles when the knees just travel forwards. It's a lot of quads. When I sit here, I'm feeling quads burning as I'm doing this. From there, I'm going to create a vertical extension. Knees extend first as the hips extend, and then from there, up onto the toes to drive up vertically and have that bar travel vertically. From that point, you're thinking about a late press. Where people go wrong is that they start dropping their elbow and pressing early. Think about creating extension first to get that bar weightless, and then from that point, let the bar float up to past the nose, and then you're pressing to move yourself underneath into whichever catch position that you're going to go to. Obviously, you'll move your feet when that bar is weightless to whichever, whether you're talking about power position, full squat, or you're talking about your split position, whichever one is your most comfortable shape. At the top, you're creating that elevation and that press. Now, big thing here is hold. Most people tend to step out of their jerk catch way too early. So dip, drive, catch, and hold that position so that you know you're stable. From there, return, or return if you're doing a push jerk, power jerk, or squat jerk, and then bring and catch the bar down. Now, I will talk about catching the bar as well. With catching the bar, you want to be thinking about letting the bar come down and breaking the elbow first. So from this point, I'm going to break at the elbow first. I'm literally going to let the bar drop down, staying locked out, or even me coming up to meet the bar. And then from there, as it touches the shoulders, I absorb through the legs. It's all about timing and practice, and you do actually need to let the bar drop. Not try and muscle it down. Because if you muscle it down to here, all you're going to do is hit your collarbones, and then eventually the weight's going to get too heavy where you can't simply catch those weights. Okay, so that's our movement and our setup and our catch positions. Now we're going to go through the specifics of each one. I'm going to do 2 reps of each variation so you can see what we're doing, and then I'll quickly talk about the specific cues on each one. So if we do the power jerk first, I'm going to set into the bar, I'm going to get my clean grip. From there, I'm going to rack in underneath that bar using both feet. In underneath. From there, full grip on the bar. I'm not letting that bar sit in my fingertips. From there, I'm flexed, I'm protracted, hips are locked under. I find my stacking point. From there, I'm going to dip vertically and then drive and dip and drive underneath that bar. Reset my feet, vertical dip. So what you would have noticed there with the push jerk is obviously the feet went wider, they shifted laterally. Like I said, I had a full grip on the bar at all times. At no point was I sitting in my fingers. That makes a huge difference to the stability of the actual the dip itself, but also the ability you can put tension into the bar and how early you can press. If you're trying to wrap your hand around it, you're going to find it very much harder to actually press early and push into that bar. Yes, it does happen sometimes, but generally, you're going to be much better off keeping a full grip on that bar. From there, as you're caught into the top, what you should have noticed is that when I caught the bar, is that the knees and hips moved equally in both directions, but I kept that elevation and that thoracic flex as I stood up. So there's a little bit of movement through the hips, but the thoracic spine and the elevation through the shoulder stayed very stable, which means that bar didn't move as I caught it. So that's the power jerk. If I go into the the squat jerk, you'll notice that lots of things stay exactly the same. The only difference is I catch significantly lower. What you should notice is I don't exaggerate the head or the chest through, which is the same with the push jerk as well. If you exaggerate that rib cage and head through, you're pushing yourself, your body weight, onto your toes to the point where you're full forwards, just like I did just then. So if you're always on your toes when you're catching your push jerks or your squat jerks, let yourself sit back. You shouldn't need to move the head at all. If you're already in a good stacked position as you start, there's no very minimal need to move the head. It'll literally be an out and in, very small movement, not big movement. Because as soon as you move the head too much, the ribs are going to go with you. It's going to pull you into retraction, it's going to pull you into that externally rotated position. And again, the bar's not stacked over the ribs anymore. So into the squat jerk, obviously I'm going to try and maintain that big flexion through my upper back. And from there, it's going to allow me to squat into that deep position. Ideally, I'll sit perfectly onto the heels. And then from there, I'm going to hold, and then I'm going to stand. And I'll do those 2 reps again. So everything sets up, drive in underneath, full grip on the bar. I'm going to create my flexion and my stack. From there, dip and drive. And same again, reset the feet. What you should have seen there is minimal movement forwards at the bottom. And that's all because I didn't throw my ribs forwards, I didn't throw my head forwards. Obviously, you need quite a bit of mobility to get down to that position. I'm not going to cover that at the moment. However, if you have more questions, flick us a message. Obviously, firstly, getting a normal overhead squat first is a priority, and then you build from there. Going into the split jerk now. Now, exactly like what we just said about the catch positions earlier, really big focal point here is make sure that you're moving the front foot to catch correctly. A lot of people make the error that when they move from their central point, their front foot will move quite a small amount compared to their back leg. Now, as you just saw, my whole body shifted backwards. End result is that they're having to throw themselves forwards and push with that back leg to then try and get themselves back underneath that bar. If you want to stay underneath the bar, you have to stay where you are. So if I'm centered here, I'm going to need to move equidistant or equal distance on the front foot and the back foot to stay over that central point, which puts me directly underneath that barbell as I catch it. It makes it very easy to stand. So if you set yourself up right, stack yourself right, dip vertically, and then split evenly, your catch should be really, really simple. You shouldn't have any stepping out or any walking or anything like that. Yes, near maximum weights, there will be small discrepancies, but the closer you practice to perfect, or as balanced as possible, less likely you're going to have those sorts of issues. So stack yourself underneath that bar, create that slight elevation in the shoulders to keep the ribs under the bar and allow that back knee to sink. And like I said, heel contact on the front foot to keep that knee behind the heel on the front leg. From there, you're looking to create a bend in that back knee to allow yourself to drop vertically. Now, one thing that I didn't speak about earlier with the catch, another common error is the foot opening on the back leg. If that foot opens, see how my hips opened straight away? That's going to create a rotation through the torso, rotation through the bar. It's going to make you a lot less stable. Also, if you try and stabilize yourself with rotated foot, it's going to be very, very hard to stabilize that position in a lunge. If you try and lunge there, it feels very wobbly, very unstable. Typically, you actually want a slight internal rotation on both sides. Toe in on the front, typically about 1 o'clock. We're not talking about like this, we're talking about 1 o'clock on the clock. And same sort of thing on the other leg. Creating an internal rotation on both sides allows the knees to bend really easily, allows for the hips to stay level and square throughout the movement. So think about adding that into your catch. So I'll demo the movement and go through those two actions. Same thing, everything stays the same. Rack underneath, full grip on the bar. From that point, I'm going to set myself, going to get myself locked out, stacked. From there, I'm going to be finding my center point. From there, dip and drive, and catch. Stabilize, front foot comes back, and catch. Same thing again. And again, no movement. So I'll hold all those shapes all the way up to pretty much maximum, and that's ideally what you want to be holding and practicing towards. And it makes it, catching those heavy bars when they are unstable and you can't just muscle them, makes it significantly easier. Okay, last things that we want to talk through is jerk variations or jerk accessories. Now, all the cues that we've talked about previously are still relevant here. Nothing changes. The vertical dip stays the same. The catch stays the same. The push press, the drive stays the same. So the variations that we're going to be talking about are the push press, which is going to teach you to push late, as well as the dip and drive and have a strong leg drive. The jerk drop is going to be talking about creating a catch position from the highest point on your head. So with a jerk, if you can get the bar to the top of your head, you should be able to drop underneath it. You shouldn't need to create any more height on that bar. If you're talking, and then the final one is jerk dip, which is literally all about the actual leg drive itself. So we'll talk about the push press and the jerk dip first, because those two go in really, really close together. We'll do the jerk dip and then drive straight into the push press. So a jerk dip is talking about just the setup. You'll walk that bar out, you'll go through the dip phase, like I said, hips under ribs, and from there extend upwards, and the bar's going to let the bar float off your shoulders and then catch down again. There is no pushing action whatsoever. Let the bar float up, let the bar come down. You're trying to create as strong a leg drive as humanly possible. The push press is about catching that bar at the point it goes weightless and then continuing to press overhead. So if I dip, drive, extend, feel that bar goes weightless, and then I'm going to press to lock out that shape, is what we're looking for with the push press. But the jerk, dip, and push press go really well together to feel that weightless point and to create that late press, because most people press way too early, which significantly reduces the amount of leg drive they get. If you press early, the bar's going to come off the shoulders, creates instability. Now the legs don't have a direct connection into that bar at all through the torso, which is going to reduce your power. So jerk, dip, and then push press. I'll label each one. I'll do 2 reps of each, and that way you can see both. Again, cueing will be the same. So from there, I'm going to rack in underneath. From that point, set the feet. Vertical dip, so I'm doing the jerk dip initially. Keep that flexion, full grip on the bar. From there, vertical dip. press and drive. Now if I go into the push press, all I'm going to do is change and add the press itself. Create that lock, create that elevation to stack the ribs. And working through that late press. Now the final one that we're talking about is going into the drop jerk. Now drop jerks can be done for your push, your squat, and for your split jerk. The concept is exactly the same. I'm going to just talk you through the split because that's probably the most relevant for most people. The principles are exactly the same, all you change is the catch position itself. So with the drop jerk, we're going to be starting that bar, holding that bar, so literally press it up and hold it at the top of your head. From there, you're going to start on your toes and balance. Now if you can't do this, obviously it's going to be hard to do this movement, so work on just being balanced and controlled in that locked out position. Really big hint, lock the knees, lock the hips, makes it way easier to balance. If you've got softness, you're going to fall forwards or backwards, depending on where the softness is. So, locked out, onto the toes, you've got that bar pressed to the top of the head. From that point there, no jumping, you are simply sliding the feet or dropping the feet to then catch in your split jerk shape. Hold, step, and regain your final position. So I'll do 2 of those with this weight. Again, this is a movement that's done at significantly lighter loads. It's not done at heavy weights. However, it can be done at heavy loads if you use safety bars out from the rig, set at the top of your head height. If you set those safety bars up, the bar is resting on those bars, so you're not holding it all, which means that you can then drop, and then you can practice standing those weights up. That is another variation that we can work with. So, focal point here is obviously the entirety is about the catch and getting that footwork right. So, if I set in, everything stays the same. From there, I'm going to press that bar to the forehead height, elbows are vertical, I'm going to stand on the toes, from that point I'm going to drop, stabilize, and stand. If I go again, press, toes, stabilize, and stand. Again, ideally we'll be hitting those catch positions specifically. Again, the hold and stabilize are really, really crucial there. So that's our full jerk variations. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions,